suspicions from observing from the distance, maybe, or did this just catch you off guard?
Well, the stories that I've heard the last week and a half caught me off guard because I've not heard it, from specifics like that. As I mentioned, we certainly learned some things when the diversity task force interviewed student athletes, and so that was sort of an eye-opening experience. Again, we started making these changes, and I was lulled into thinking that these were good steps, and that it was improving. And I was basing that on my experience as I went to practice, as I watched games. I see all the NFL players or non-NFL players that love to come back and be a part of the program. So I was convincing myself that the changes we were making a difference. My eyes were wide open this past week and a half when I heard the stories that I heard. Yeah.
Gary, just given that, why didn't Iowa acknowledge those issues in 2019 when you heard about them from the diversity task force?
Well, we did acknowledge them. We talked about them in the PCA, and we talked about moving forward some of the things that we wanted to work on. But again, it didn't make the magnitude of what we're now all seeing and thinking and hearing about this last week and a half. So we did acknowledge it. We didn't focus on it, but we put a plan in place to work on it. And as I'm admitting to you now, in hindsight and in context of what I've been hearing over the last week and a half, it wasn't enough, and we didn't do enough at that time, back in 2018, in hindsight. But we absolutely are focused on it and attending to it today.
Gary, several players had mentioned both Brian Ferentz, Seth Wallace, in some of their concerns of different incidents. How are those concerns going to be addressed? Is this part of the task force? And as officially Brian Ferentz's supervisor, what happens if he is mentioned and there's grounds for some sort of punishment, including termination?
Well, I think, I mentioned that on one hand, the independent review, we didn't need the independent review to show us that we have issues, because we know we do. But on the other hand, the independent review is important and critical to go into detail in concerns and then bring us back what they found. So, I'm not going to speculate on anything that's been talked about over the last week and a half as it relates to personnel, independent direct personnel, and I'll wait to see what comes back there. I'm not going to predetermine what I might hear, but clearly individual, if there are personnel issues that I need to deal with coming out of that, and or if there are just decisions that we can bring to the task force, we'll sort that out as the independent review is concluded.
Yeah, 2014, sorry, I got tied up here. You fired Tracy Griesbaum for bullying athletes. If this review comes back and determines there's been bullying, we hold those coaches to the same standard.
Well, let me just say that each situation that I deal with or that we deal with is unique. So I'm fine with the question. It's a fair question, but I'm also very understanding that every situation is unique. So I'm going to judge this situation on what comes forward in its unique sense. What is in common, and this sounds simple, but student athletes having an opportunity to have a great experience academically, athletically, and socially is critical. And that's the case whether it's field hockey or football. And I'm going to wait and see what comes back. I'm going to take that in account compared to other information that I have, and we'll make decisions based on that. But I'm not saying it's unfair because it's a fair question. I'm saying that every situation is slightly different, or maybe significantly different. It just depends.
Gary, you've been to a lot of football practices over the years. You've traveled with the team a lot of times. Were there ever instances when you saw things, heard things that were red flags in your mind? And also, did you ever attend off-season strength and conditioning sessions?
I've been in the weight room, but I don't ever remember being in there when it was active with working out. That's not, I try to go to practice during the fall about once a week. I don't always make it. I do travel with the team. Spring ball, I might make it to 1 or 2 practices. And to answer your question directly, did I ever see anything that raised a flag as it pertains to this? The answer is no. Do I see coaches yelling and screaming? Yes. Yelling and screaming is going to occur in coaching. And the way I always differentiate it, if someone uses a bad word, that doesn't cross a line. If someone yells really loud, that doesn't cross a line. Where I see crossing a line is when it becomes personal and not about whatever it is that's trying to be corrected. And to answer your question, no, I didn't see anything that crossed the line in the time that I've been here. And I've not been in the strength and conditioning room during workouts. It's just not, it just isn't something that, it's in a different building and it's at a time of year when I'm not with football regularly.
Had you had it?
Gary, when we asked Kirk about Brian about 10 days ago, he said that there were different levels, the allegations between Chris and Brian. Did you have a say in those conversations, and what about these situations and allegations? Where did you kind of come up with the conclusion that they were different levels, and have you talked to Brian in the last 10 days about that?
Okay, there's a few questions in there. One, that's okay. One is different levels of expressing concern. Here's what I'll share with you that I did on Saturday morning. I am not someone that spends much time on social media. I'm not against social media. It marvels. I have my 2 kids and the amount of time they spend. I just don't know where they find the time, and I just don't spend a lot of time there. Saturday morning, as I was hearing about what was occurring on social media, I spent a pretty good amount of time looking at what was being said. Beyond that, I have not spent time over the last week and a half. I just haven't had the time. And at some point, what's said on social media is not my focus. What I'm going to focus on is this internal or this independent review. And so I don't know everything that's been said about Chris Doyle or about Brian Ferentz. I've heard Seth Wallace's name mentioned. I'm sure Kirk has been mentioned. I'm sure I've been mentioned. But I don't know exactly what's, and I'm comfortable now waiting until that review. So if there are differences in levels between what Chris has been accused of, or Brian's been accused of, or Kirk, or Seth, or anybody else, sorry to name names, but I've heard those names come forward, that's where it's going to become really important for the independent review to bring forward what they learned.
Gary, I wonder why you said it would take a couple weeks for the review to come back. What was the decision that went into settling with Chris Doyle and essentially giving him $1 million instead of waiting until the end of the investigation was done?
Yeah, obviously, at some point, I came to the conclusion that what are the steps we're going to have to make to start moving forward? I wasn't, I knew that the independent review is going to occur, but I also knew that we needed to think of things that made sense, that were thoughtful and sensible to move forward. And that was one of the things that I felt just we're in strength and conditioning time right now, volunteer work. And I just decided that it made sense, it was sensible, and it was just a move forward. So I decided, and again, Kirk and I were in full agreement on that being a step, and I started having conversations with Chris, and I just decided that was a step. So the independent review is a step. Some of the things that have been going on with the team meetings was a step, and I decided this was an important step to start moving forward.
Gary?
I'll keep trying to get to everybody.
What gives you the confidence that Kirk can lead the program moving forward, and how do you explain Kirk having what he calls blinders to so much of this taking place over the last decade or so?
Well, I'll start with what do I base that I still have confidence that Kirk can move the program forward. Several things, but one, working with him for 15 years, seeing all the things that I shared that were positive. And then over the years, when we found something that isn't positive, the seriousness and the way that he goes about trying to fix things that are not good. And so I've watched him, I've observed him for the last week and a half, or whatever it's been since a week ago Friday. And I know how this is impacting him. I know, what he's trying to do to move forward. And I know the difficult conversations he's having and his willingness to change. And so those are the things I'm basing it upon. As it pertains to not knowing or should have known, he knows as the leader of the program that he's responsible for everything and that occurs in his program. And how much he knew or didn't know, he and I have had several conversations about that. And I believe him that, he didn't know all the things that he's heard. And that, you'd have to ask him, but I'm confident that what he did know is that there were areas we could get better at, we needed to improve on, and they weren't enough, the things that we were doing. So I can't answer directly, other than what he shared with me, that he didn't know many of these things, and his willingness to say, I need to change, I need to get better. I base it on those things, as well as 15 years of watching him when he needed to make changes, his willingness to change.
Gary, how
Let's go here.
Gary, kind of two questions. Have you heard from parents over the years that express concerns about Chris Doyle or any of the coaches? And also, Ohio State has the COVID policy. I'm wondering if you guys have, still have a pandemic going on too. Did you make student athletes sign some sort of release?
So that's two very unique questions, but maybe you were worried it wouldn't get back to you.
Yes.
So I'll try to answer both of them. First of all, I've had conversations with parents, not very many, but a couple, not about the types of allegations we're hearing in the last week and a half. It might be a parent who thinks that they should have had more playing time. I don't have a lot of those. Maybe thinking that there was a misunderstanding, but nothing to the level that we're talking about. So that's my direct answer to that. I see a lot of parents at games. I interact with parents a little bit, but I haven't had many real deep conversations with parents. And then to switch gears to COVID, we're still in the middle of trying to figure out the pandemic. I feel good about the way we're trying to bring people back. To answer your direct question, we have a pledge that our staff and our student athletes sign. It's not a release. It's more of a commitment and understanding that in order to reduce the possibility of someone getting infected, we all have to take personal responsibility. So every day I have to take a quiz or a test. I have to get my temperature taken. I tested. I was negative, and so I sign a pledge as well, like we ask our student athletes to sign.
Gary, how concerned are you right now about recruiting? The football program's ability to recruit right now under these circumstances?
Well, I think about it this way, Pat. If, as a parent, and I am a parent, but if I had a parent coming here, my first inclination would be concern, and rightly so. I haven't spoken to Kirk and the staff exactly what they've done, other than to know that they've followed up with all the families. And so my guess is a lot of them are either convinced or are going to wait and see. But certainly anytime your program goes through a negative situation and a challenging situation, it potentially can impact recruiting. It's not number one on my list of concerns right now. So more importantly, let's get it handled. Let's start putting the plan in place to move forward, and then recruiting will take care of itself. So.
Yeah, Gary, I was thinking, through the years, obviously, Chris Doyle was graded well on performance reviews because of the way the team performed on the field, the strength and conditioning that was applied to the way they performed. And I'm sure he passed those reviews with flying colors, and now we come to this point. And it hadn't been for James Daniels and a tweet that kind of ignited, because of that thing that happened to George Floyd, for people to speak freely about what's going on. Will there be additional lines added to the criteria of that performance sheet for different coaches in the future, or how will you handle that evaluation?
So I think the best way to try to answer that is, yes, we'll make sure processes are in place, and we'll do those things. But more importantly, something you said a few moments before that, and it's what I've been trying to allude to, and it's when I do get emotional, and that is just our country being more comfortable to talk about this topic. I was in a conversation with 5 of my peers. I'm not avoiding your question about Iowa football. But, I had heard the term DWB. I'd heard that over the years, but hadn't thought much about it. Driving while black. I was in a conversation with several of my colleagues who were around the country, and there were probably 4 or 5 of them who were black. And they each told their personal story about the person when they were a young boy or just starting to drive that told them how they needed to act. Again, I've had conversations about race before. It's easy to say racism is horrible. But the subtleties of learning from colleagues and friends of mine and student athletes about what it's like to go through that is very impactful. Back to your question. Excuse me. We have processes in place, and I think our university processes are good. We'll improve them where they need to be improved. We can put more in a job description, but until we create an environment nationally and then drill down into Iowa athletics and Iowa football, where forget the form or the piece of paper or the job description. Are we really creating an environment where you have a place where you can share a concern and you know it's going to, one, you're comfortable sharing details and not just sugarcoating. You have to be willing to say, this is really happening to me. And as somebody who's been discriminating against, I understand more than ever before how hard that is. Even if someone's telling you they want to know, are you really going to be comfortable sharing the hard facts? And as I described to you in that team meeting last Monday, had those students, you talk about a former player who helped get it started. It also took some current players in the room, because there were no former players other than those that were on the staff that played, but there were no former players in that team meeting. Somebody have a Kleenex? There were no former players in that team meeting, and so it took courage and trust for those current players to speak up. So to me, that's probably one of the biggest changes that is occurring in our country. It is occurring in Iowa football. It needs to occur in Iowa athletics, and is. But we've got to have comfort that we can share openly and not be retaliated against, whatever that might be defined as. If it's your job, if it's scholarship, whatever it is. Excuse me, just a second.
Got time for just a few more questions.
Did you have any conversations with any of the former players who spoke up on Twitter? And if so, how would you characterize them? If not, I guess why wouldn't you have had conversations?
I have. Not a lot, but yes, a few. And those that I had, I would characterize as very honest and outgoing, upfront and direct, but also very supportive. So, again, I didn't have a lot of them, but those that I did didn't mince words, were very direct, but also love this place and want to see it get better, and help do that, help do their part to do that.
Gary, we had got requested and got a copy of Chris Doyle's, what was said to be his current contract. It looked like from that contract that he was in a period of 1-year extensions that would then be signed to be effective July 1st. If that was the case, why was that contract just not renewed? Can you talk to the state of his contract at this point?
Yeah, I mean, yes, he had a contract, but what really became our area of focus is coming up with a separation agreement. We use the contract as a guide, but I decided that to move forward sooner rather than later, right now, let's move forward, and it was the sensible right thing to do, in my opinion, to help take that step. We created a separation agreement rather than enact a particular term in his contract.
But it sounds like it was effective July 1st, so it could have been right now, right? Or
Obviously, I've looked at his contract, but I mean, there are several different things that can occur within a contract. So, again, the focus wasn't 100% on his contract. The focus was, in my opinion, the sensible and most thoughtful way to go forward was to come up with a separation agreement. We did that. We didn't ignore the contract, but we did it in discussion independent of it.
You're going to have, I would assume, players who ask you how you can pay Chris Doyle $1 million to walk away. Do you have any answer for that to them?
Again, acknowledge that he did have a contract, but then more importantly to me, I have to find a way to help move us forward. And in my opinion, this was a thoughtful and sensible way to move forward. And I understand, Mike, that I mentioned in some of my comments, there's going to be a lot of opinion of what we should do, what I should do, what Kirk should do moving forward. There's going to be a lot of opinion in terms of how fast something should happen. And in all those cases, it doesn't make anybody else right or wrong. It just means those opinions, probably whatever decision I make or Kirk makes or any of us make, like some other situations, there's going to be a group that thinks it was the right idea. There's going to be a group that thinks it's the wrong idea. I sat down in listening and hearing and trying to make a decision to move forward and decided that this was, I've said it a couple times, but I'll say it again, this was the sensible, the timing, the thoughtful way to take one step. It's not by any means the only step, one step to move forward.
Gary, you've talked a number of times about these conversations that you've had in the past few weeks that have gone on a deeper level about racism than you've had in your career. Presumably that means you've learned more about some of these power structures in this country that continue to keep racial inequality as it is. Have those conversations changed the way you might do your job, the hiring practices you have, the way you evaluate people? Have they made you look at your own work and how you can make changes in your job?
Well, the broad answer to your question is yes. I've learned a lot. I've heard a lot. My guess is, I haven't thought specifically about some of the things you've asked, but my guess is every time I make a decision moving forward in personnel and hiring, and I'm going to remember this moment in time. Shame on me if I don't. So specifically, I have committed myself way before any of this to be concerned about and care about diversity, whether it's racial diversity, geographic diversity, gender diversity. I've tried to, when I hire staff, I've tried to make that a priority. But you're right, this moment in time will like me to reflect and think even more when I go about those decisions.
Knowing, what led us here, some dangerous or I guess damaging patterns of behavior with Doyle were occurring. As you look back on the Rhabdo situation now, was it do you feel like you missed the mark in not taking action then, that you sort of should have seen some of this coming?
I'm going to, again, Chad, the question you asked about field hockey and now a question about Rhabdo, those are fair questions. I'm not at all saying they aren't. But I haven't looked back and given myself and paused, say I should have done something differently at that time, because at that time, you might recall, we had a group on campus that consisted of medical professionals. It was a different situation, so I'm not looking back on that and thinking, what should I have done back then? Again, I'm trying to focus on this situation with what we're dealing with what we're hearing, not just with Chris Doyle, with all the things I've heard in the last week and a half, with the things that I heard a year and a half ago, and listening to that team meeting, and now trying to say, forge a way forward. What can we learn from what has happened, but what can we do, must we do, going forward?
Just one or two more questions if we have anything. Rob, go ahead.
There's a lot of talk about the power dynamic between players and coaches. And with all that going on, are you afraid that current players, even after all this, are still going to be afraid to speak out? And what specifically can you do to give them confidence that they are free to speak out without any repercussions?
So yes, there will always be a hierarchy, and there will always be whoever sits in the chair. In my chair as athletic director, as a head coach's chair, coaches have a lot of influence, without question. Earlier, we were talking about how do you make sure that there is a place to go, there's an outlet for a student athlete or a staff member to go if they're concerned about that hierarchy, if they're concerned about if they say something, it will impact their job status or their status as a student athlete. And so we have spent time on that in the past. We've spent a lot of time on it in the past. The topic that I've mentioned about the diversity task force, and maybe it won't keep the name task force, maybe it will have another name, but that group is a group that we need to make sure the student athletes know the people on the committee, as opposed to just being names. We need to make sure that they interact with the committee so that they have a trust factor. And they know that if they come into one of those situations, they can go there outside of their coaching situation. I hope that answers your question.
Rob, final question?
Yep.
Kirk was asked this on Friday about his ability to manage Brian or supervise Brian. You're obviously directly in charge of him. Do you feel like you can manage him? And we've all thought about this. If a situation like this came up, it could be a little sticky. And if you do feel like you can manage him, why is that so?
Good question. And it's obvious that Brian's relationship to Kirk. And so for that very reason, the university has a process. People might speculate that we don't, but we don't take it lightly. Brian and I do have regular conversations throughout the year. And they are, one of the things I've described it as, when it comes to football, X's and O's, Brian should not be coming to me for advice or having conversations. Although I did play the game, but most importantly, that's he and Kirk. Where Brian and I have had conversations over the years, if we have, unrelated to this current topic, where we've had a situation that I've needed to deal with, it has been me. I'm sure Kirk has talked to him, but Brian and I have had very specific conversations about an area that I've wanted him to address. And then we've had very specific situations about his career and improving and preparing himself to continue to get better as an employee. So we have those conversations regularly.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate your time today.